Have you ever bought something thinking it was built to last, only to realize later that a single flaw ruined everything? Imagine buying a car, a machine you trust for years, only to find out it has a hidden weakness that could leave you stranded or, even worse, put you in danger. That's exactly what happened to thousands of GM owners, and to this day, many of them are still angry about it. Stay with me until the end of this video because we're going to uncover one of GM's biggest engineering failures, a mistake that cost the company millions and broke the trust of countless drivers. And here's the real reward. By the end of this video, you'll know how to avoid similar car disasters, so you never fall into the same trap. GM, a name built on trust. Until this happened, for decades, General Motors was a name people trusted. If you grew up in the US, Canada, the UK, or Europe, chances are you knew someone who owned a Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, or Cadillac. These cars were everywhere, and for a good reason. GM was known for building reliable, powerful, and comfortable vehicles. Back in the day, a GM car was something you could count on. It was the kind of vehicle that fathers passed down to their sons, the kind that lasted hundreds of thousands of miles with basic maintenance. The company had a loyal customer base, especially among drivers over 40, 50, and even 60 years old, people who had driven GM cars for decades and never imagined they would be let down. But then, something changed. GM made a decision, one that seemed like a brilliant innovation at first, but ended up becoming one of the most frustrating features ever put into a car. Thousands of drivers, many of whom had been loyal to GM for life, found themselves angry, betrayed, and dealing with expensive repairs. The beginning of a major headache. This wasn't just a minor glitch or a recall that got fixed overnight. No, this was a problem that dragged on for years, affecting thousands of vehicles and causing countless headaches for drivers. Some were left stranded on highways, others found themselves dealing with expensive repairs, and many more simply lost trust in GM forever. What made it even worse? GM's response. Instead of owning up to the issue immediately, the company took its time, leaving drivers to deal with stress, repair bills, and safety risks on their own. If you've ever owned a car that suddenly failed you when you needed it most, you know exactly how frustrating that can be. Cars aren't just machines, they're part of our daily lives. We rely on them to get to work, take our families on trips, and simply go about our routines without worry. So when a car fails unexpectedly, it's more than just an inconvenience, it's a betrayal of trust. A problem that wouldn't go away. Here's the real kicker. This issue didn't just affect one model or 1 year. No, it spread across multiple GM vehicles, meaning thousands of drivers across North America and Europe found themselves dealing with the same frustrating problem. Some car owners tried to fix it themselves, only to find that it was a design flaw baked into the system. Others went to dealerships, only to be told it would cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars to repair. The frustration built up over time, and eventually the issue became too big to ignore. Drivers started filing complaints, mechanics raised red flags, and the internet became filled with angry discussions about this one problem. But what exactly was this feature? What was the one mistake that turned GM's once loyal customers into some of its biggest critics? That's what we're about to uncover next. Stay with me, because the real story is even worse than you think. For decades, General Motors was more than just a car company. It was a symbol of American engineering, power, and reliability. If you wanted a car that could go the distance, handle rough roads, and last for years without major issues, GM was the name people trusted. From the 1950s to the early 2000s, GM cars were known for their strong engines, comfortable rides, and solid craftsmanship. Families in the United States, Canada, the UK, and Europe relied on GM vehicles for their daily commutes, road trips, and weekend getaways. A GM car wasn't just a purchase, it was an investment, something that owners expected to keep running for decades. Older drivers, especially those who grew up in the muscle car era, had a deep connection with GM. The company gave the world classic models like the Chevrolet Impala, Buick Riviera, and Cadillac DeVille, vehicles that weren't just cars but icons of a golden era. But as the years went by, things started to change. GM wasn't just competing with Ford and Chrysler anymore. Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda entered the market with cars that were cheaper, more fuel efficient, and required less maintenance. European brands like BMW and Mercedes-Benz attracted luxury buyers who once swore by Cadillac and Buick. To keep up, GM had to innovate. But not all innovations turn out the way they're supposed to. The shift to new technology, a risky move by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the auto industry was changing faster than ever. Governments introduced stricter emissions regulations, fuel efficiency became a top priority, and customers wanted newer, more advanced features. GM, trying to stay ahead, made a critical decision, one that seemed like a step forward but ended up becoming one of their biggest mistakes. This wasn't just a new engine design or a cosmetic change. This was a fundamental shift in how GM cars operated. The company introduced a feature that was supposed to make driving easier, safer, and more efficient. But instead it caused breakdowns, led to lawsuits, and left thousands of drivers furious. Many GM owners started experiencing unexpected failures, leaving them stranded on highways, in parking lots, or even in their own driveways. Mechanics were baffled. Some blamed cheap parts, others blamed bad design, but the real issue was bigger than anyone expected. Loyal customers felt betrayed. For years, GM had built its reputation on reliability. People trusted GM cars because they were supposed to be simple, durable, and easy to repair. But suddenly, that trust was broken. Drivers in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, many of whom had been GM customers their entire lives, found themselves dealing with a problem they never saw coming. These weren't reckless teenagers or careless first-time car owners. These were experienced drivers who had owned multiple GM vehicles and knew exactly how their cars should perform. For them, the frustration wasn't just about a single mechanical failure. It was about losing faith in a brand they had relied on for decades. GM's reputation took a hit. As complaints started piling up, GM had a choice to make: either admit to the problem and fix it quickly, or try to downplay the issue and hope it would go away. Unfortunately, GM hesitated. Instead of addressing the problem head-on, the company took its time, releasing limited recalls and vague statements that left customers even more frustrated. Some drivers had to pay out of pocket for costly repairs, while others simply gave up on GM altogether, switching to Toyota, Ford, or even European brands that seemed to care more about their customers. The internet made things even worse for GM. Car forums, review websites, and social media were filled with complaints. Stories of engine failures, electrical malfunctions, and unexpected shutdowns spread like wildfire. What was once considered a trusted car company was now losing its most loyal customers. But the worst part? This wasn't just about money or inconvenience. This feature failure wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Some drivers reported near accidents, others were stranded in unsafe locations, and for many, the stress and frustration of dealing with constant repairs became too much to handle. By the time GM finally acknowledged the issue, the damage had already been done. Customers were furious, lawsuits were filed, and the company faced one of the biggest reliability scandals in its history. But what exactly was this flawed feature? How did something designed to improve cars end up ruining thousands of vehicles instead? That's what we'll uncover next, as we break down the technical flaw that cost GM millions and left its customers angrier than ever. For decades, GM built cars that were known for their mechanical simplicity. Many drivers, especially those who had owned multiple GM vehicles over the years, appreciated how straightforward these cars were. If something went wrong, it was usually an easy fix. But then, everything changed. In an attempt to modernize its vehicles, GM introduced a new feature that was supposed to make driving more convenient, efficient, and technologically advanced. On paper, it sounded like a great idea. It was marketed as an upgrade, a step toward the future, something that would make GM cars smarter and better than ever before. What happened instead was a disaster. This wasn't just a minor issue that could be fixed with a simple recall. It was a fundamental design flaw that affected thousands of vehicles, leaving drivers stranded, frustrated, and furious. At first, most owners didn't even realize what was happening. The problem started small: a strange warning light on the dashboard, a slight hesitation in performance, a momentary loss of power. Nothing too alarming. But then, things got worse. The feature that turned into a nightmare. The ignition switch system, a tiny yet crucial component, was designed to control the electrical power to the vehicle. It seemed simple enough. Turn the key and the car starts. Turn it off and everything shuts down. But this basic function turned into one of GM's biggest engineering failures. The flaw? The ignition switch could unintentionally move out of the run position, shutting off the engine while the car was in motion. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It meant that while driving at highway speeds, a GM vehicle could suddenly lose power, disable the power steering, shut off the airbags, and leave the driver struggling to maintain control. This problem wasn't just affecting one model, it spread across multiple GM vehicles, including popular cars like the Chevrolet Cobalt, Saturn Ion, and Pontiac G545. For drivers who had been loyal to GM for decades, this was more than frustrating, it was dangerous. Real stories of frustrated drivers. Imagine this. You're driving down the highway at 65 miles per hour. Everything seems fine until suddenly your engine dies, your steering becomes stiff, and your brakes feel weak. You panic, gripping the wheel, trying to guide your car to safety. The vehicles around you are moving fast, and for a split second, you're completely helpless. This wasn't just a nightmare scenario. It happened to real people, real families, and real GM owners who never expected their car to betray them like this. One driver reported how their car shut off in the middle of an intersection, narrowly avoiding a collision. Another recalled losing control on the freeway, barely managing to pull over before an accident. For many, the worst part was that they had no warning. The car didn't give a clear signal before shutting off. One moment, everything was fine. The next, the vehicle was completely powerless. Older drivers, many in their 50s and 60s, were hit especially hard. These weren't reckless teenagers or inexperienced drivers. These were people who had spent decades behind the wheel, people who knew how to handle a car, yet still found themselves in dangerous situations they never should have faced. Why this was more than just an inconvenience? Losing power in a moving vehicle is bad enough, but the real danger came from what happened after the ignition switched off. The moment the engine lost power, the airbags became completely disabled. If a driver lost control and crashed, there was nothing to protect them. Multiple fatal crashes were later linked to this issue. Families who trusted GM found themselves grieving lost loved ones, all because of a tiny ignition switch failure that could have been prevented. For a company that had built its reputation on safety and reliability, this was a complete disaster. GM's initial response, a costly mistake. At first, GM's reaction was frustratingly slow. Instead of immediately recalling the affected vehicles, the company hesitated, downplayed the issue, and kept selling cars with the faulty ignition switch. Some mechanics even reported that GM had known about the problem for years. But rather than fixing it immediately, they calculated the cost and chose to delay a recall. Documents later revealed that the company estimated it would cost just 90 cents per car to fix the issue. Yet they still didn't act fast enough. For GM owners, this was infuriating. Drivers who had trusted the brand for decades suddenly felt betrayed. Instead of prioritizing customer safety, it seemed like GM had put profits over people. The breaking point: when drivers had enough. By the time GM finally issued a recall, the damage was already done. Over 2.6 million vehicles had been affected. Lawsuits started piling up. The government launched investigations, and worst of all, more and more drivers were coming forward with horror stories about how this flaw had nearly cost them their lives. For some, the recall came too late. Fatal accidents linked to the ignition switch failure had already occurred, and families demanded justice. GM's reputation took a massive hit. The once trusted brand was now at the center of one of the biggest automotive scandals in history. And yet, the ignition switch was just the beginning. There was another issue lurking beneath the surface, one that made things even worse for GM and left even more drivers furious. The ignition switch failure was already a massive problem, but what made things even worse was how long GM had known about it and what they did to keep it quiet. For years, reports of stalling engines, locked steering, and failing airbags had been trickling in. Mechanics, engineers, and even GM's own employees had seen the signs. But instead of immediately acting, the company buried the issue, ignored complaints, and continued selling vehicles with the same deadly flaw. It wasn't just corporate negligence, it was a full-blown cover-up. Early warnings that GM ignored back in 2001, engineers at GM first noticed something strange during pre-production testing of the Saturn Ion. The ignition switch was too easy to turn off, even with a slight bump. That should have been an immediate red flag. But rather than fixing the problem before releasing the vehicle, GM pushed forward with production, selling thousands of cars that had a built-in defect. Then, in 2004, a GM technician driving a Chevrolet Cobalt experienced an engine shutdown while testing the vehicle. This was 2 years before the Cobalt even hit the market. The technician reported the issue, engineers investigated, They found out that the ignition switch could turn off if the key was too heavy or if the driver accidentally bumped it while driving. GM knew the danger, but nothing changed. By 2005, GM engineers actually tried to quietly fix the problem. They redesigned the ignition switch, but here's where things got even more suspicious. They never gave the new part a new identification number. This meant that no one outside of GM, not dealerships, not mechanics, not even car owners, could tell the difference between the faulty switch and the updated one. It was a deliberate move to avoid triggering a recall, the consequences of ignoring the problem. By 2007, GM cars were stalling on highways, losing power mid-drive, and disabling airbags. The company was fully aware, but instead of taking responsibility, they tried to quietly settle cases and avoid bad publicity. Families of crash victims started asking questions. Investigators noticed a pattern. One of the first high-profile cases involved 29-year-old Amber Marie Rose, who lost control of her Chevy Cobalt in 2005 after the ignition switch failed. The airbags never deployed and she lost her life. Her family was devastated. They demanded answers, but at that time GM refused to acknowledge the ignition switch failure. They claimed it was driver error. It wasn't until years later that the truth came out. Her accident was one of many caused by the defect GM had known about all along. The lawsuits start piling up. By 2010, more and more GM owners were experiencing the same terrifying failures. Some drivers barely avoided deadly crashes, while others weren't so lucky. Lawsuits were filed, victims' families pushed for investigation. The U.S. government started looking into the issue. By 2012, it was clear that GM had been hiding the truth for over a decade. The pressure kept building, whistleblowers started coming forward, and finally in 2014, GM had no choice but to admit the truth. They had been selling cars with a known deadly defect for years. The massive recall that came too late. When the truth finally came out, GM was forced to recall over 2.6 million vehicles with the faulty ignition switch. But for thousands of drivers, the recall was too little, too late. By the time GM acted, at least 124 deaths had been officially linked to the defect, though many believe the real number is much higher. The public was outraged. Drivers who had trusted GM for decades felt completely betrayed. GM's attempt to save face once the backlash hit, GM went into damage control mode. They set up a $600 million compensation fund for victims' families. They fired 15 employees, including some executives. They paid over $900 million in settlements. But no amount of money could erase the fact that for years, GM had put profits over human lives. The scandal shook the entire automotive industry. It exposed how big car companies can hide deadly flaws, delay recalls, and gamble with their customers' safety. Even today, many GM owners still don't trust the company the way they used to. Because once a brand betrays its most loyal customers, earning back that trust isn't easy. Once the recall was announced, GM found itself at the center of one of the biggest legal battles in automotive history. Drivers were furious. Families of crash victims were demanding justice. Lawmakers wanted answers. And the public? They wanted to know how one of America's most trusted car companies could knowingly put lives at risk for more than a decade. The ignition switch scandal wasn't just about faulty engineering. It was about corporate deception, negligence, and a complete disregard for customer safety. And when the lawsuits started rolling in, GM had no choice but to face the consequences. The government steps in, a historic investigation. As more evidence surfaced, it became painfully clear that GM had been hiding the defect for years. The U.S. government launched a full-scale investigation, and it didn't take long for federal prosecutors to uncover damning internal documents. Emails, memos, and reports showed that GM executives had been warned about the ignition switch issue as early as 2001, long before the first recalled vehicles even hit the road. And yet, instead of fixing the problem, GM chose to cut corners, downplay the risk, and continue selling vehicles with a known safety defect. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no way for GM to escape accountability. The record-breaking fine and criminal charges in 2015, GM agreed to a $900 million settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice to avoid criminal prosecution. The company was charged with wire fraud and conspiracy as prosecutors argued that GM had intentionally misled regulators, dealers, and the public about the defect. But for many victims' families, the settlement felt like a slap on the wrist. No GM executives were sent to prison, no one at the company faced serious criminal consequences, and while GM admitted to failing to act sooner, they still avoided a full-blown trial that could have exposed even more damaging secrets. The company had to pay billions in lawsuits, settlements, and recall costs, but at the end of the day, GM was still standing. The cost of betrayal. GM's reputation in shambles. Even though GM survived financially, the brand's reputation was destroyed. For decades, GM had been one of the most trusted car manufacturers in the world. It was a company that families relied on, a symbol of American engineering. But after the ignition switch scandal, everything changed. Lifelong GM customers walked away from the brand, vowing never to buy a GM vehicle again. Car buyers started questioning if other manufacturers were hiding similar deadly flaws. Trust in the entire auto industry took a major hit. GM tried to rebuild its image by launching new safety initiatives, promising that nothing like this would ever happen again. But the damage was already done, because when a company puts profits over human lives, people don't forget. After the legal battles, the massive recalls, and the billion-dollar settlements, GM found itself in an even bigger challenge: winning back the trust of its customers. For decades, GM had been a household name, a brand that American families had relied on for generations. But the ignition switch scandal had shattered that image. Loyal customers felt betrayed. The public saw GM as a company willing to risk lives to save a few dollars. And car buyers? They started looking at other brands, questioning if GM vehicles were still safe to drive. Rebuilding a reputation after a scandal this big wasn't going to be easy. A new CEO and a public apology. In 2014, just as the ignition switch controversy exploded, GM brought in a new CEO, Mary Barra. She was the first female CEO in GM's history, and she was given an almost impossible task: clean up the mess, regain trust, and make sure nothing like this ever happened again. One of her first moves was to issue a public apology. She acknowledged the company's mistakes, admitted that GM had been too slow to act, and promised that they would take full responsibility for their failures. She even testified before Congress, answering tough questions about why GM had ignored the defect for over a decade. But while some saw her actions as a step in the right direction, others weren't convinced. Because a public apology doesn't bring back lost lives, and for many families it was too little too late. New safety measures, was it enough? To prove that the company had changed, GM launched a series of new safety programs. They created a Speak Up for Safety initiative, encouraging employees to report potential defects or safety concerns without fear of retaliation. They also established a global safety organization, hiring more engineers and safety experts to prevent future design flaws from being overlooked. And to make sure nothing like the ignition switch failure happened again, they redesigned their recall process, promising that any safety issue, no matter how small, would be immediately investigated and addressed. On paper, these changes looked great, but for thousands of drivers, the damage was already done. Because when a company deliberately ignores a life-threatening defect for years, it's hard to believe that they suddenly care about safety now. Sales dropped, the cost of a broken reputation. GM may have survived the financial hit of the lawsuits and settlements, but their reputation took a major blow, and so did their sales. Many longtime customers abandoned the brand, choosing to buy from competitors like Ford, Toyota, and Honda instead. Even used GM vehicles lost value. Car buyers were wary. People didn't just look at GM models differently. They questioned whether the entire auto industry was hiding other deadly secrets. Trust isn't something that can be bought back overnight, and GM learned that the hard way. Even after GM tried to clean up its image, the ignition switch scandal left a permanent scar not just on the company, but on the entire auto industry. Because this wasn't just about one defect or one manufacturer. It was a wake-up call for the entire world, exposing how easily car companies could cover up dangerous flaws and delay life-saving recalls just to protect their profits. And in the years that followed, the effects of this scandal reshaped the way automakers do business. More government oversight. Regulators step up. Before the GM ignition switch crisis, government regulators often relied too much on automakers to report problems on their own. There was no strict enforcement, and recalls often happened only after multiple deaths or lawsuits forced action. But after the GM scandal, everything changed. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, came under intense pressure to crack down on automakers that failed to report defects quickly. They introduced harsher penalties for companies that failed to issue recalls on time. They also tightened their investigation process, making it harder for automakers to hide dangerous design flaws for years. The message was clear. No more cover-ups, no more excuses. Stronger whistleblower protections, employees speak up. One of the biggest reasons GM got away with the ignition switch defect for so long was fear inside the company. Many employees knew about the problem. Some spoke up, but their warnings were ignored or buried. Others stayed silent, afraid of losing their jobs. That changed after the scandal. In 2015, the U.S. government introduced stronger whistleblower protections for auto industry employees. This meant that if an engineer, mechanic, or even a factory worker discovered a hidden safety issue, they could report it without fear of retaliation. In fact, under new laws, whistleblowers could even receive financial rewards for exposing dangerous defects that companies tried to cover up. Suddenly, automakers had nowhere to hide. Automakers forced to prioritize safety over profits. The GM scandal showed the world that some automakers were willing to gamble with human lives to avoid costly recalls. But after the backlash, no company wanted to risk becoming the next GM. Car manufacturers invested more money in safety testing. They strengthened their recall processes, making it easier for customers to check if their vehicle had a known defect. Some companies even launched transparency initiatives, promising to publicly report safety concerns before they became deadly failures. Because one thing was now certain, hiding a defect was no longer an option. The public became more aware. Drivers started asking questions before the GM ignition switch disaster. Most car buyers never thought twice about vehicle recalls. If a company said a car was safe, people believed it. But after the scandal, that trust was broken. Drivers started paying closer attention to recalls. They checked vehicle history reports more carefully, making sure a used car wasn't part of a past recall that was never fixed. And most importantly, they demanded more accountability from automakers. Because once the public realized that a company like GM could knowingly sell dangerous vehicles for years, they started questioning every car brand on the market, a scandal that will never be forgotten. The GM ignition switch scandal may have faded from the headlines, but its impact is still felt today. It changed the way regulators handle recalls. It forced automakers to be more transparent, and it made drivers more aware of the risks they face every time they get behind the wheel. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that when corporations put profits over people, the consequences are deadly. And no amount of apologies, recalls, or lawsuits can ever change that. Even though years have passed since the GM ignition switch disaster, the effects of this failure are still being felt today. The legal battles may have ended, and GM may have tried to move forward, but for many drivers, the damage was permanent. Some lost loved ones, others suffered life-changing injuries, and thousands were left driving cars they no longer trusted, even after GM claimed to have fixed the issue. Because the truth is, when a company delays a recall for over a decade, customers are left with serious doubts about whether their vehicle is truly safe. Drivers who never got their cars fixed, even after GM announced one of the largest recalls in automotive history, not every affected car was repaired. Some owners never received recall notices due to outdated records. Others simply ignored the recall, assuming it wasn't serious. And then there were those who wanted to get the issue fixed but ran into major delays, dealership shortages, and endless waiting lists. GM struggled to provide enough replacement parts for millions of vehicles, meaning some drivers had to continue using their unsafe cars for months or even years before a repair was available. And for a company that claimed to prioritize safety, this was just another failure in a long list of broken promises. The resale value of GM cars took a hit when news broke about the ignition switch defect. GM vehicles lost value almost overnight. Car buyers were hesitant to purchase used GM models even if they had already been repaired. The risk of another hidden defect made many think twice before trusting GM again. Dealerships saw a drop in demand for recalled models. Owners who wanted to sell their vehicles found themselves getting lower trade-in offers simply because of the scandal. And even today, some GM models from the recall era still carry a stigma. Because once a brand is associated with hiding safety issues, it takes a long time for that reputation to recover. Lingering fear. Can GM be trusted again? Even after GM's safety reforms, stricter regulations, and corporate apologies, many customers still don't trust the company. Loyal GM buyers from past generations, people who once swore by Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, and Cadillac, now think twice before purchasing another GM vehicle. Because if the ignition switch defect could be covered up for over a decade, how can anyone be sure that another deadly flaw isn't lurking in GM's new models? No amount of safety programs or public promises can erase the fear that this scandal created. And for many former GM customers, that fear was enough to make them walk away from the brand forever. Beyond the lawsuits, the recalls, and the corporate apologies, there was a deeper, more personal cost, one that GM's balance sheets could never reflect. Because this wasn't just about defective cars. It was about real people whose lives were forever changed, families who lost loved ones, survivors who suffered lifelong injuries, and countless drivers who lived with the constant fear that their car could fail them at any moment. The true cost of GM's delayed recall wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in human lives. Families who lost everything. For the families of those who died because of the ignition switch defect, no settlement could ever replace what they lost. Mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, people who should have been safe behind the wheel, were suddenly gone. And the worst part? Their deaths could have been prevented if GM had acted sooner. One of the most well-known cases was Brooke Melton, a 29-year-old nurse from Georgia. She died in 2010 when her Chevy Cobalt stalled in the middle of the road. Her parents were devastated. At first, they thought it was just a tragic accident, but when they dug deeper, they found something horrifying. GM had known about the defect for years and did nothing. Her family became one of the strongest voices in the fight for justice, helping expose GM's cover-up to the world. And they weren't alone. Dozens of other families shared similar heartbreaking stories. Loved ones taken too soon because of a problem that could have been fixed with a simple, inexpensive repair. Survivors, left with lifelong injuries. For those who survived crashes caused by the ignition defect, life was never the same. Some suffered permanent brain injuries, leaving them unable to work or live independently. Others were paralyzed, forced to rebuild their lives from a wheelchair. And then there were those who lived with chronic pain and trauma, knowing that their suffering was completely avoidable. Imagine waking up every day knowing that a company's greed destroyed your future. That was the reality for many survivors. And the worst part? Some of them didn't even know their crashes were caused by the defect until years later when the recall was finally announced. The mental toll, fear, anxiety, and distrust, even for those who weren't directly affected by a crash, the scandal left a deep psychological impact. Drivers who owned recalled GM vehicles lived in constant fear, worried that their car could suddenly stall at the worst possible moment. Many changed the way they drove, avoiding highways, driving slower, and gripping the steering wheel with anxiety, waiting for something to go wrong. And when they finally got their cars repaired, that fear didn't just disappear overnight. Because once you realized that the company you trusted was willing to risk your life to save a few dollars, it's impossible to feel safe again. A lesson written in blood. The GM ignition switch scandal wasn't just a corporate mistake. It was a deliberate choice, one that cost innocent people their lives. And the effects of that choice didn't end when the lawsuits were settled or when the recall was completed. The pain, the loss, and the fear that GM created will never fully go away. Because when a company puts profits over people, the consequences are permanent. When the truth about the ignition switch defect finally came to light, General Motors faced one of the biggest financial reckonings in automotive history. The company had spent years avoiding responsibility, downplaying concerns, and delaying recalls. But once the public, the government, and the courts got involved, there was nowhere left to hide. And the cost? Billions of dollars, thousands of lawsuits, and a permanent stain on GM's reputation. Because when a company puts profits over human lives, the price they pay goes far beyond money. The cost of the recall was massive. GM had to fix over 30 million vehicles worldwide, making it one of the largest recalls in history. Each repair cost only a few dollars per car, a tragic reminder that this entire disaster could have been prevented years earlier with a simple, inexpensive fix. But in total, GM ended up spending more than $4 billion on recall costs, including repairs, rental cars for affected drivers, and dealers. And that was just the beginning. Lawsuits and settlements, the legal battle that wouldn't end. As victims and their families came forward, GM was flooded with lawsuits. More than 100 wrongful death and injury claims were filed against the company. The evidence was overwhelming. Internal documents proved that GM executives knew about the defect for years and chose to ignore it. To avoid a lengthy public trial, GM agreed to a massive settlement fund for victims, totaling nearly $600 million. Families who had lost loved ones received compensation, but for many, no amount of money could ever undo the damage. The company also faced hundreds of class action lawsuits from customers who felt deceived. They had purchased GM vehicles believing they were safe, only to later discover they had been driving a ticking time bomb. Government fines, the largest penalty in auto history. The U.S. government wasn't going to let GM walk away without punishment. The Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation, and in 2015, GM was forced to pay a record-breaking $900 million fine for covering up the defect. This was one of the largest fines ever imposed on an automaker, sending a message that hiding deadly defects would no longer be tolerated. But even as GM paid out billions, many people felt the punishment wasn't enough. Not a single executive went to jail. The people who made the decision to ignore the defect and allow unsafe cars to stay on the road walked away without facing criminal charges. For many, this was yet another sign that corporations could get away with putting profits over safety as long as they were willing to write a big enough check. Stock market shock. GM's reputation crumbles. When news of the scandal broke, GM's stock price plummeted. Investors panicked as the company's deception and negligence were exposed. Billions of dollars in market value were wiped out in a matter of weeks, and shareholders lost confidence in GM's leadership. For years, GM had been one of the most trusted names in the auto industry, but now, that trust was shattered. Even after the lawsuits were settled, the recalls were completed, and the fines were paid, GM struggled to regain the public's confidence. Because once a company is exposed for knowingly risking human lives, rebuilding trust is nearly impossible. The true cost of GM's mistake. In the end, GM paid billions of dollars in fines, lawsuits, and recall costs. But the true cost of the ignition switch scandal wasn't financial. It was the lives lost, the families broken, and the trust destroyed. Because no matter how much money GM spent trying to repair its image, the world would never forget the deadly choice they made. A choice that put profits over people and cost innocent lives. When a company spends decades building its reputation, losing trust takes only a moment. For General Motors, that moment came when millions of customers realized the company they relied on had knowingly put their lives in danger. This wasn't just a recall, it wasn't just a fine, it was a betrayal. One that hit GM's most loyal customers the hardest, because for generations, GM had been a symbol of American engineering, a company that families trusted, a brand that people grew up with. But after the ignition switch scandal, everything changed. Loyalty turned to outrage. For decades, GM had a deep connection with its customers. Many had been buying GM cars their whole lives. These were people who remembered the golden age of American cars. The Chevy Bel Airs, the Buick Rivieras, the Cadillac Fleetwoods. They had passed down their loyalty from generation to generation. But now, that trust was shattered. Because it wasn't just about a mechanical failure, it was about what that failure revealed. A company that knew about the defect and hid it. A company that let innocent people die just to save a few dollars. And for many lifelong GM owners, that was unforgivable. The silent boycott. Customers who walked away GM may have survived financially, but they suffered a deeper, longer-lasting loss. The customers who left and never looked back. Many people who had spent their whole lives driving GM vehicles made a choice. Never again. They switched to Ford, Toyota, Honda brands that hadn't been caught covering up deadly defects. And it wasn't just about anger. It was about fear. Because after what happened, how could anyone be sure that GM wouldn't cut corners again? Dealerships felt the heat. It wasn't just GM's corporate offices that faced the backlash. Local GM dealerships, many of which had been in business for decades, were suddenly dealing with angry customers, canceled orders, and lost trust. People who had been loyal customers for years now saw the GM logo as a symbol of deception. Sales dropped. Trade-ins for GM vehicles increased. Dealerships struggled to convince buyers that GM had changed. Because no matter what the corporate office said, customers weren't listening anymore. The damage went beyond just one scandal. Even customers who weren't directly affected by the recall felt betrayed. If GM could cover up something as deadly as a faulty ignition switch, what else were they hiding? Were their other vehicles truly safe? Was GM really committed to protecting its customers? Or was it just another corporation looking out for its bottom line? These were the questions millions of drivers started asking, and for many, the answers led them away from GM forever. Rebuilding trust, a challenge GM still faces. Years later, GM has tried to repair the damage. They've introduced new safety measures, new quality control checks, new promises, but for many former customers, it's too little too late, because once trust is broken, getting it back is nearly impossible, and GM learned that the hard way. The ignition switch scandal wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a moral failure, one that cost GM an entire generation of loyal customers. A company can survive a recall. It can even survive billion-dollar fines. But what GM faced after the ignition switch scandal was something much harder to fix: a damaged reputation, lost trust, and a future that suddenly looked uncertain. Because this wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a corporate culture that allowed deadly mistakes to be ignored, and the world was watching to see if GM had truly learned its lesson. Sales took a hit. Customers were no longer interested. When news of the recall and cover-up spread, buyers reacted fast. GM had spent years rebuilding itself after bankruptcy, launching new models and trying to win back customers, but after the scandal, many walked away for good. Sales for models directly affected by the recall plummeted. Dealers had to offer deep discounts just to move vehicles off the lot. Even GM's flagship brands like Chevrolet and Cadillac felt the impact, because when customers lose confidence in one part of a company, they start questioning everything it makes. And in an industry where safety matters more than anything, that kind of doubt is deadly for business. The government stepped in. More regulations, more oversight. After the ignition switch scandal, the auto industry changed forever. Lawmakers, regulators, and safety agencies knew one thing for sure: they couldn't trust automakers to police themselves. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, tightened safety reporting rules. Car companies were now required to report potential safety issues sooner, before they became deadly. And government agencies started scrutinizing recalls more aggressively, making sure companies couldn't delay or hide problems like GM had. For GM, this meant constant oversight. Every move the company made was watched closely. Every safety report was examined for signs of another cover-up. And if GM thought it could ever get away with something like this again, the message was clear. Those days were over. Executives were forced out. But was it enough? When a scandal of this scale happens, someone has to take the blame. GM's top executives faced intense pressure. Lawmakers, customers, and safety advocates wanted real consequences. Several high-ranking executives were forced to resign. Others were quietly removed from key positions. But the question remained, was this real accountability or just a public relations move? Because despite the deaths, the cover-up, and the billions in fines, not a single GM executive went to prison. For many, this felt like a slap on the wrist. A few lost their jobs, but the people responsible for hiding a deadly defect for over a decade walked away without criminal charges. And that sent a dangerous message, that even when corporations risk lives for profit, they can still escape true justice. GM's desperate attempt to rebuild its image with sales down, customers leaving, and regulators watching, GM had one last option: damage control. The company launched a massive public relations campaign, promising that things would be different this time. They announced new safety measures, stricter testing, and a renewed commitment to transparency. They hired a new CEO, Mary Barra, who promised to change the company's culture from the inside out. And they poured millions into advertising campaigns designed to rebuild trust. But the problem? Words mean nothing when actions say otherwise. Customers weren't convinced, because how could anyone believe that a company caught lying for years had suddenly found honesty? The lingering shadow of the scandal years after the recall, GM is still trying to move forward. The company has introduced new models, new technologies, and even electric vehicles, but for many, the ignition switch scandal is something they can never forget. Because when a company puts profits over lives, that's not a mistake, that's a choice. And the cost of that choice will haunt GM forever. Some scandals fade over time, Others leave scars that never fully heal. For General Motors, the ignition switch crisis wasn't just a moment of bad press, it became a permanent stain on the company's legacy. Because trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. And for many former GM customers, the damage was done. The cost of a betrayal. For more than a century, GM had been one of the most respected automakers in the world. It had built cars that defined generations. The Chevrolet Impala, the Cadillac Eldorado, the Pontiac GT. These weren't just vehicles. They were symbols of American innovation and reliability. But the ignition switch scandal changed everything. For millions of drivers, GM was no longer the brand of trust and tradition. It was a brand that had put profits above people. And no amount of advertising, recalls, or public apologies could erase that reality. A lawsuit that exposed GM's true priorities. When victims of the ignition switch defect sued GM, the courtroom battle revealed disturbing truths. Internal company emails, memos, and meeting notes painted a chilling picture. GM's executives knew about the deadly defect for more than a decade, but instead of fixing the problem, they calculated the cost of doing nothing. And their decision? It was cheaper to ignore the problem than to issue a recall and take responsibility. This wasn't just corporate negligence. It was a deliberate act of deception, one that cost at least 124 lives and injured hundreds more. And when those details became public, GM's reputation crumbled even further. The market's reaction. Investors took notice. The fallout from the scandal wasn't just felt by customers. Wall Street reacted too. When GM's cover-up was exposed, stockholders panicked. GM's stock price tumbled, and investors lost billions overnight. Because if a company was willing to hide something as serious as a deadly defect, what else were they keeping from investors? For years, GM had promised stability and growth. But now, the only thing growing was the number of lawsuits. And the only thing stable? The company's declining reputation. Other automakers watched and learned. GM wasn't the only company that paid attention to the scandal. Other automakers saw what happened and knew they had to change. Toyota, Ford, Honda, and others tightened their safety policies. They improved defect reporting. They strengthened internal oversight because they knew that in the age of the internet and instant news, a cover-up couldn't stay hidden forever. And no company wanted to end up like GM, facing public outrage, government investigations, and the loss of lifelong customers. The customers who never came back. Some customers eventually forgave GM, but many didn't. For them, the ignition switch crisis wasn't just about a faulty part. It was about a company's value. They had trusted GM for decades. They had passed down GM cars to their children, believing in the brand's reliability. And now, they wanted nothing to do with it. Even after GM paid billions in fines and compensation, many former customers never returned. Because safety isn't something you get a second chance on. And GM had proven that when it mattered most, it couldn't be trusted. A scandal that won't be forgotten. Years have passed since the ignition switch crisis, but its impact still lingers. For every GM commercial promising a new era of safety, there's a driver who remembers the cover-up. For every shiny new GM model on the road, there's a family who lost a loved one due to corporate greed. And for every executive who still sits in a boardroom, there's a former customer who never forgave, never forgot, and never looked back. Because some mistakes don't just fade away, they become a permanent part of history. And for GM, this scandal will never truly